Okay, I think we'll start. I think we've hit some kind of steady state on people joining. Thanks so much for coming on. This is our monthly general meeting of New York City VOAD. My name is Zach Hotson. I'm with the Salvation Army, and I get the privilege of co-chairing the board of directors of New York City VOAD with I.O. Harrington, with L.E.S. Reddy, the legendary I.O. Harrington. As advertised, we're going to talk today about Ukrainian refugees, some already arriving in our city. So what's going on now and what we can anticipate in some ways. And we'll have guests from both Catholic Charities, Immigrant and Refugee Services, and from the Shorefront Y to speak to us about that. But before we get to that planned programming, Eric Stossel from New York City Emergency Management, I believe he's agreed to give us an update on the unfortunate shooting incident yesterday in Brooklyn and New York City Emergency Management's coordination efforts around that event. So I'll leave space for Eric.
Yeah, hi everyone, good morning. New York City Emergency Management was activated yesterday in response to the transit explosion at 36th Street. We sent out alerts to the Family Assistance Center lead team, as well as the Service Center lead team, just to prepare for an actual in-person brick and mortar location. But we just sent out situational awareness emails. For a Family Assistance Center, we're looking, the trigger point for us is 10 fatalities or more. And we did not hit that trigger. However, we put everyone on alert. We were also working with DOE, Department of Education, for school dismissal and how kids, any high school students, because Sunset Park High School is right by that subway station, as well as 5 other schools in that 1 mile radius. So we were looking at areas that are cordoned off. What does DOE need from NYPD or MTA for support? And we had a couple of coordination meetings yesterday to help with bus lanes and how increasing the ferry service that's around there, as well as rerouting trains along that area, especially for people who need to go to Bay Ridge or Coney Island. So that all coordination happened today. This morning, we deactivated our virtual situation room. We also had the Unified Victim Identification System activated yesterday. As of 0900, that has been deactivated as well. We had about 57 people call 311 for assistance, and they were all taken care of by NYPD Missing Persons Squad. And so we are, our virtual sit room has been deactivated as of last night. We'll still be available for coordination calls that might happen with the MTA, NYPD. But in terms of, it seems that they have a suspect in custody. We don't know if he is the perpetrator at this moment, but hopefully we'll hear more from NYPD at their press conference later today. Zach, did I miss anything?
No, I think that's what we want to know.
Yeah.
Great.
So thank you. Thanks for that update.
Thanks. Anybody have a quick specific question for Eric that I'm sure he won't have the answer to, but okay. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks.
While we wait for our guest from Catholic Charities, who's joining soon, we also have joining today Race Hodges, new to FEMA Region 2. And Race, I just wonder if you could take a second just to introduce yourself to the crowd.
Hi, yes, good morning, everyone. Uh, so my name is Race Hodges. I am the faith-based coordinator for FEMA Region 2's National Preparedness Division based here in New York City. And I just wanted an opportunity to introduce myself to the attendees of this meeting this morning. I believe I met several of you at the New York Disaster Preparedness Summit for religious leaders a few weeks ago, but I am new to this position. I've been in this role for about 2.5 months. So I am, continuing to introduce myself to stakeholders. My mission is to support faith-based organizations and houses of worship with their disaster preparedness needs. So both at the organizational level, supporting them with developing emergency operations plans, but then also working with congregants and constituents with furthering their disaster preparedness support as well. So I'm sure I'll be a frequent attendee at these meetings, but if anyone is interested in connecting with me, I did include my contact information, my phone number, and my email address in the chat box. And again, I look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself this morning.
Of course. Welcome to the network. Glad to have you. And now for the purpose of the morning. So our first guest is Mario Russell from Catholic Charities, Immigrant and Refugee Services, who will share with us possibly some work that they've already begun doing, but certainly an organization that has some idea of what we can anticipate potentially over the next weeks and months. So I turn it over to Mario.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for having me with you this morning. And thank you to the group for obviously coordinating and organizing this meeting as you do. I apologize if occasionally you'll hear some noise in the background. There's some construction going and I seem unable to escape it. So let me know if it's oppressive, and we'll have to work through that. So I am the director of Catholic Charities, Immigrant and Refugee Services here in New York City. We cover basically New York City and about 7 of the upper counties north of the city. Our work in this field generally has been ongoing for well over half a century, and in recent years has significantly expanded, and really with the intention to attend to the many and I think often intractable problems that migrants and immigrants face in the last 20, 30 years, actually, whether it's the phenomenon of unaccompanied children who come to the southern borders looking for assistance, whether it's undocumented workers who kind of chronically don't have a way forward, or whether it's figuring out responses to ever new and evolving or devolving situations around the world. So just to kind of give you a brief synopsis of what we do to kind of place our work in context, we provide kind of across the board, as innovative as we can, legal services that are responsive to the situation and the needs and the location of folks that we help. So we are in the courts, we're in the immigration courts, we're in the federal courts, we're in the family courts. We have essentially kind of a public defender presence there. And certainly we will see and imagine and already are beginning to encounter Ukrainian families, recent Ukrainian arrivals who are entering that system. We also, though, provide legal services kind of from a clinical model, which is to say that we move about as needed into communities, let's say in Monticello, in the lower Hudson Valley, or Poughkeepsie, or perhaps a library in an afternoon in Dutchess County. So we kind of have also learned that it's necessary and valuable to sort of move what we do to where people are and where people find it probably harder to access services there. We provide services of English instruction and cultural orientation through our international center. We have an unaccompanied minors program that serves close to 5,000 kids a year in the area. Believe it or not, there are close to a dozen shelters that house temporarily children who have come from the southern borders for the most part and are looking either to reunify with a family member or often end up in temporary or long-term foster care. So we help those children with their immigration legal needs as they enter the shelter system and then eventually leave it. We have a day labor program in Yonkers and one in the Bronx that does just that, right? It serves about 2,500 day laborers. We both empower them to kind of know their rights and responsibilities in the workplace. We empower them to teach them leadership sort of skills and training, and obviously even safety certification and safety awareness and other sort of elements that go to what is for them, for the most part, kind of, as I said earlier, kind of an intractable situation. There is no kind of legal relief that's available to them. Congress has to figure that out. But in the meantime, our mission is really to support and strengthen their experience here as citizens, right? As whether it's lowercase or uppercase, they have and live here for a long time. We run 2 or 3 hotlines. I say 2 or 3 because it depends on how you count them, but national, state, and citywide hotlines that provide information and referrals to any number of people who are calling with either a specific need, a specific question, or a need for services. And then finally, we provide refugee resettlement assistance. And this is kind of the subject of today's, I think, meeting. We provide services to about 1,000 newly arrived refugees or asylees, victims of certain kinds of trafficking or crimes, or what are called special immigrants, people who have what's called SIV status. Might be individuals who helped the military, let's say in Afghanistan or Iraq, and have been given a certain kind of protective status by Department of Homeland Security. All these folks come to our office, and what we help them with, and what we will be doing, of course, with the Ukrainian arrivals, we don't know exactly in what form they will arrive, but we will help them with the same structures and modalities that we do to this population I just described, whether it's refugees, asylees, special immigrants, victims of trafficking, or other, which is essentially kind of the fundamentals of case management. Sometimes we call it transitional supports, right? Do you have a house? Do you have a relative with whom to stay, perhaps for a week, perhaps for 2 weeks, perhaps for 3 months, so that we sort of have that transitional support. Accessing health, accessing benefits, accessing educational supports, learning the basics of orientation, and whether it's how to use a subway, how to get from point A to point B, and then over time, as we settle them out of that transitional moment into a more longer term living situation, which often might mean that they move from New York into Westchester or to Long Island. We work with them to develop employment and job placement opportunities. So we do employment prep and job placement. So this is kind of generally what the refugee resettlement team does. We work with people really from literally all over the world. I mean, in that sense, New York is I think probably fairly particular. Whether it's Southeast Asia, Africa. Ironically, I think in the 2005 to 2012, many from Eastern Europe, many from Russia at the time. Central America, of course, even South America, Venezuela, and we obviously touch on the sort of lagging indicated phenomenon of, sort of political and social devolution, as you might see it. So whether it's Venezuela, as I mentioned, or Syria, right? So back in 2011 to 2015, we worked with a fair number of folks from there. Most recently, we, starting in August and into September, we were deep into the Afghan evacuation crisis, as it's called. And in some ways, I think the US and we learned a fair amount about what to do right, what to do wrong, and probably what will be done again that's both right and wrong in that context. So Afghanistan, I think, may become a bit of a precursor to what we will see with the Ukrainian, we'll call it resettlement or refugee resettlement of the 100,000 or so that most of you, I assume, are aware was announced by the administration that it would accept over the course of the next, we don't really know, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, hard to say, but I know that there is sort of a process being structured to ramp in to the United States, these folks. But again, what we did with the Afghan evacuees, as they're called, and eventually really mostly are paroled into the United States, right? About 76,000 or so came and were placed in military bases throughout the United States. I actually had the occasion to visit 2 of them and do some legal orientations there. And, understood and saw that because the United States cannot and doesn't have the capacity to process them as refugees, which is really a, frankly, 24-month to 24, sometimes 36-month process. It's a multi-year process to actually have someone begin and then the process of obtaining refugee status and entering the United States with that refugee document. What the US did with the Afghan crisis was essentially parole, provided a parole document, which intuitively, it's really the reverse of what we think, right? Parole is usually a document that gets you out of, let's say, prison or something. Well, in this case, it's a document that temporarily allows you into the United States. It's essentially like a ticket for entry to the movie theater, but it doesn't allow you to stay permanently. It doesn't have within it a vehicle towards permanent residency or citizenship. It usually expires after a year. In the case of the Afghans, they sort of gave them for 2 years. So what's missing on the back end of that parole, quote, status is really a durable long-term solution. And I don't anticipate that the Ukrainians who will come will have anything that's much different from what the Afghans received over the last 6 months, essentially, that they arrived. Most Afghans have this parole status, which forces them to have to wrestle down a long-term immigration benefit, basically either in court in front of the judge, if they are in what's called deportation proceedings, or at the administrative level in front of the asylum office, where they would be interviewed by an asylum officer, an interesting use of the word, by the way, to present their asylum case, which has to be, heavily documented, presented, prepared, narrated, communicated, and usually you have to have a lawyer in the room to help you kind of do that. So it's a very cumbersome, tedious, and in some senses also, not to mention, expensive process. And as where we stand now, that's probably what most Afghans will have to do as it stands now, and what probably most Ukrainians will have to do if and when they arrive. Now, a couple of things to say about that. But let's focus for a minute, and then obviously we'll sort of wrap it up. The work that we will be doing will be very similar as we did with the Afghans, which is to say, providing all of that kind of temporary resettlement, case management, transitional support that we do. So to the extent that there will be Ukrainians families who come to New York, and I'm sure there will be, obviously New York is home to what is said to be the largest Ukrainian population in the United States. It makes only a lot of sense that many will come here, despite the cost of living, which is a disincentive to the United States, is sending anyone to live in New York as a refugee. They do send them here because of family ties. So rather than sending a refugee here and paying their rent, the US government will say, you can go to New York because you've indicated that you have an uncle, an aunt, a godfather, a cousin, a brother, a sister, whoever that has essentially provided, quote, assurance. In other words, they have invited you to stay in their home for an indefinite amount of time until you find another solution or a way out. So for as an example, we provided services to about 70 Afghans over the course of the last 6 months, and all of them essentially entered New York City through that mechanism. They all stayed with someone whom they knew and who had assured or vouched for them. In one instance, we had a family of 11 that came to stay in a two-room apartment in Far Rockaway, right? And they were there for, I think, 3 weeks until we were able to work with some community groups in Westchester and move them to Yonkers. But that's really how the mechanism would look. And obviously, we Catholic Charities or HIAS or IRC or CAMBA, some of the other refugee resettlement providers will all be doing the same work and supporting these families in that transitional time. As of now, there are no Ukrainian families indicated or referred through the national sort of assignment and referral system yet. Some families have been coming from the borders. So what you read about potentially in terms of, oh yes, there are a couple of families that are moving to Boston. We've read about those. I've been on some calls with partners from Catholic Charities USA. That is true. There are families arriving, but they're arriving through the sort of more off the grid or self-styled processes. So again, about 3,000 Ukrainians have been permitted to enter the United States through the southern border. They would not be part of that 100,000, right? They would not have been identified in Warsaw or in Budapest or wherever. That the 100,000 who come will have been identified basically at a safe city in Eastern Europe or elsewhere, and then provided transport and referral to the United States. But again, we are seeing, and some of us maybe even on this call are seeing some Ukrainians arriving. Maybe they had a visitor visa, or maybe they got a visitor visa and they've come here in the last couple of weeks. Fundamentally, they probably had the same problems and issues as the others who will join later. So we look to provide them with all the kinds of case management and likewise, support that we can. What they don't get, these families who come sort of on their own or through the border, what they don't unfortunately get at this point is sort of entree into the refugee resettlement structures, benefits, and even cash assistance that is available to them, and that the Afghans did receive, and that we anticipate that the Ukrainians who will come will also receive. We are working with New York City and the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to design and plan right now a response that New York City can layer on top of what will be the federal support and response that we anticipate, but there's always gaps, particularly New York. New York is an expensive city. So what the federal government typically provides, and that they provided for the Afghans, that they would provide for Ukrainians, will be likely insufficient. So we are working with the city to kind of think through how to improve the supports from a case management perspective and also from a cash assistance perspective, frankly, that would be otherwise lacking. We're also working with the city to kind of plan and develop a legal response. And there are two legal responses here to think about. One is, how do you help people who are here already, right? What about Ukrainians who are here, who have been here and are effectively stuck, or their circumstances have changed because of the war? What kind of help do they need? So maybe, again, they might have asylum cases that they need to put forward, or perhaps are eligible to apply for what's called temporary protected status, which is a benefit that has been created both for the Ukrainians and for the Afghans by the Department of Homeland Security. So it's a little bit better than parole. You have to have been in the United States to be eligible for it before a certain date. But it is what it is. It is what it says. It's temporary. So it's a temporary protected status that enables you to work, to stay here lawfully, to not be deported. But it too is just temporary and needs a further, more durable solution down the road. So we will be working both to provide that sort of TPS, temporary protected status support, but also again, looking at more longer term solutions. The last thing I think I will say about kind of the eventual resettlement of Ukrainians and likewise the Afghans is that both of these situations lend themselves to what's called ameliorative legislation. In other words, where the Congress says we recognize that this particular population has particular needs and we want to respond to them. So we're going to design a law that supports just this group. We've done that before. We've done it, for instance, to support Cubans who had fled after the war and during the Cold War. So in 1966, we created a thing called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And basically all it said was, if you can show that you're Cuban, if you can show that you've arrived, at a certain point in time and that you've been here for at least a year, you're eligible for a green card. That's it. Bottom line. After the Afghan crisis began and some time went by, in the late fall of 2021, similar proposals were put on with bipartisan support for the Afghans. One such proposal was called the Afghan Adjustment Act, which essentially said the same thing as the Cuban Adjustment Act that I mentioned, which essentially said, if you're from Afghanistan, you've arrived before a certain date, you can get permanent green card legal resident status. That's still being essentially debated, and it didn't make cut this spring at the legislative level. It didn't enter into kind of a package of bills, but I wouldn't be surprised that that will come through in time. And I suspect, the reason I mention this, that I suspect, and I wouldn't be surprised if, given the Ukrainian sort of crisis and the politics of that a similar bill will be introduced with bipartisan support to protect and permanently offer permanent sort of solutions to Ukrainians who are in the United States. And my guess is maybe that's something that we would see in the next, 12 or so months, maybe a little bit longer, and might be a combined Ukrainian-Afghan adjustment bill. But that's just me speaking, so don't quote me. You can disbelieve it entirely, but it's a sense I have of how that might work, because I think the politics for both, for the moment, seem to line up. That's what I wanted to share and offer. Maybe there's a couple minutes of questions, but I hope that maybe that rounds out a little bit of what we see as the issues.
Mario, thanks so much. Yeah, if we do have maybe a couple minutes for questions, I want to leave time for our other presenter, but anyone have an immediate question for Mario? I'll fill the dead air. Mario, I hear you speak of the good and the bad of the Afghan process. Can you give me one of both? That you're, the bad that you're concerned gets transferred to this, and the good that we should apply.
Sure. One of the bad was that because the Afghans came in as what's called parolees, as I mentioned earlier, they were eligible for some things in the sort of benefits sort of menu that refugees might be entitled to, but they were not eligible for many others, whether it was WIC, TANF, or others. And there's really no reason for that, right? So unless that, and that did eventually get fixed, but it took a lot of advocacy and missed opportunities. So that's an example, in a sense, of what we potentially may repeat. And with and when the Ukrainians arrive, is can we have this properly dressed up before they come so that we're all clear and the administration has made it clear that they're eligible for the same suite of supports and benefits that refugees are entitled to, and that we don't get lost into sort of these regulatory differences. I also think that some of the bad in some senses is, once you have this parole structure, there isn't really part B prepared. Yes, you've given folks kind of this temporary reprieve for a year, maybe two, but what's on the other side of that? And I think that we can advocate, frankly, either for the Adjustment Act and or for legal services. I'll say the good. Well, look, I know that the way we exited Kabul was problematic, but I think that was less to do with the manner of the exit from the airports than the manner of the exit from our commitment over the years. But that was obviously chaotic, but in some ways it was a heavy lift, and they did do it. They did land it, and frankly, they managed to work it out. So I think there's probably some pretty good learning about how you can use the parole process in a positive way and in a creative way to help people in need and not get hung up on the refugee processing piece. So I think in that sense, we probably learned, okay, this works. Let's do that again. Let's use parole. Let's facilitate people's arrivals. What I think we need to do better, though, is what happens on the other side of parole.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. One other sort of very practical question. There's some Reverend Karen Jackson in the chat has asked how we can refer to your program if folks are coming to us who have arrived from Ukraine.
You bet. So I think I saw yesterday, someone may have shared the list of VOLAGs and voluntary agency and that do refugee resettlement in New York City with the names and email addresses of the contact people. Do you know if that email was circulated to this group? But I would suggest perhaps that if you wanted to, you could cut and paste that and put it into the chat, or I can find it and send it to you.
Yeah,
but again, that would be the best way.
Mari, if you're willing to send that to me, I certainly can share it with our distribution list.
Sounds good. Okay.
Thanks so much.
You bet.
Zach, there was someone waiting to get in. Did they manage to join us?
There's no one in our waiting room.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Don't worry.
I might have been the last person to join. This is Sue Fox.
Hey, Sue. Well, our next presenter, speaking of, is Sue Fox from the Shorefront Y, that many of us would know from Sandy long-term recovery and her work in the surrounding communities there, and the Brooklyn long-term recovery group. Another legend of the New York City disaster ecosystem, who has already been doing some work with some of the folks, as Mario referred to, that have come through the southern border. So Sue, I'll give you the space.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. So, I am the executive director of the Shorefront YMYWHA, which is a settlement house and Jewish community center located at the ocean in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. Brighton Beach, also commonly called Little Odessa for a number of decades already, is home to the largest Russian speaking community probably anywhere in this country. And I would say 75 to 80% of my staff speak Russian as their first language. And a good 50 to 60% of those Russian speakers either are children of families who emigrated from Ukraine or themselves people who were granted refugee status in the 70s and into the 90s and came here under that status. And so what I thought I would talk about a bit is the culture of what we're seeing. Let me give you a sort of a scope. We're taking about 50 to 75 calls a day from people who have arrived, as well as from local families asking about their relatives who are overseas in various countries in Eastern Europe for the most part. We are adult literacy providers, quite a large adult literacy providers of 1,500 students per year. We're starting our next cycle on Monday with 100 to 150 newer arrivals from Ukraine, being put into 7 level 0 classes, meaning they have absolutely no English. We have not seen that at the Shorefront Y probably since the 70s, that there were so many people coming in with no English as getting our services. We've had level 1s, level 2s, but not level 0. So it's kind of an interesting moment in time. We're having people coming in needing childcare, needing, pregnant people showing up needing healthcare. So I want to talk a little bit about culture. First, I want to say that it is extraordinarily confusing to the existing Russian-speaking community who may have come from the Soviet Union when the word refugee, and I'll say lowercase refugee in much of the media, is being used to describe this population, and they came in as uppercase refugees, meaning they have that status, why people who are arriving today are not eligible for a range of services that were available to them when they arrived in this country as refugees. People have arrived here with 1 suitcase, 2 suitcases of some clothing that they may have been able to squirrel out, and that's it. They have most of them have little or no money, and they're squirreling things together to find housing. We have people who've come through the southern border. We identified that route probably 6-7 months ago, and I could share with you all the interesting Russian language videos and now Ukrainian videos explaining to people exactly what to do and what to say. Most seem to now be coming through Tijuana and getting here to New York with this temporary parole status. But we're also seeing people who have various kinds of visas that they've been able to fly from Europe, someplace in Europe, and enter the US. We've seen people who have flown in on expired documentation from the US government. So there was a little more leniency, I think, earlier on. Now we're seeing many more tourists, people who had open tourist visas who are arriving. And it is extraordinarily complicated. I get calls. I haven't gotten a call this week, which is kind of nice. I usually get calls from the city asking me how many people we're seeing. And I was like, I don't know. I cannot tell you how many people there are. We just know how many people are showing up. But we're dealing with a population of Eastern Europeans who generationally have been brought up to always be ready to flee. Whether that's World War II experiences. This is, if you ask Sue Fox, the American-born, who speaks a lot of Russian, but American-born with parents who are American-born, I never would be sitting on suitcases and my passports with the expectation I would need to flee this country and go someplace else. But that isn't the attitude that those who come from the countries of the former Soviet Union and maybe other places in the world have been brought up with and are ready to do. And so they're ready to flee, but they don't have the ability to know what to do when they come here. So I will tell you some of the good resources that we have found, because you need to know that there are some things that are out there. For instance, there is a health program run by Health and Hospitals that many of you have seen TV ads for. There's NYC Cares. And that is really helpful for adults who have been in the country for 6 months or more, because there is a 6-month residency requirement. But we have discovered that Health and Hospitals also has an options program. And that program is available with no residency requirement. And that for people who come from a country where they had access to healthcare, unlike many people don't have that access here in this country, this is something that they're quite fearful if they were to get sick, what would they do? And just to make sure everybody knows, if somebody is very sick or, is in a terrible accident, emergency Medicaid would care for them, but it is not the same kind of protection. Children get basically Medicaid. They get Child Health Plus. Children are eligible to go to school. It's different from school to school around here. The local elementary school, which is 4 blocks away from us, has taken in since just before the invasion. So I think starting just that last week in February, at least 20 to 25 children, mostly from Ukraine, but some from Russia and some from Belarus as well. People are fleeing that part of the world if they can. That's a complication for the schools that are not always accustomed to having so many new students arrive, and so many new students who arrive with tremendous language needs, and having also experienced those from Ukraine, children having seen and witnessed the horrors of war and the fear of crossing that border, and then living and not knowing what's happening. Please remember that it is since the invasion, it is basically only women and children and older adults who are able to exit. The men are staying and fighting, and are actually conscripted to be fighting and not able to cross those borders. So one challenge we face here is people who are arriving, some may look for permanency, and for some, a temporary situation is just fine because they're very optimistic. I don't know if that's realistic or not, but they're optimistic that Ukraine will win and they'll be able to be reunited with their husbands and fathers and brothers that are still in Ukraine. Emotionally, it's a very complicated situation for them. Housing is going to be a huge issue. I don't know how long people are going to be magnanimously generous if they've come to relatives and friends and friends of friends and friends of relatives to be able to keep them in apartments. We do not have large homes here where people are able to give rooms. It's also oftentimes a floor someplace, and people are looking for legal support as well. This pregnant pause in figuring out what TPS temporary protected status might mean for some and not for others is interesting, and all of these new announcements as to what parole status is going to be, especially those who are crossing the southern border seem to be getting it and starting to get their work authorization as well. But it is quite confusing. Food pantries are available for people to be able to go to, but it's very short-term fixes and no real understanding of how this is going to be able to be addressed long-term. For me, it is housing is the major concern, and without a viable solution yet on the table. It sort of reminds me of all the disaster work we've done, and how, although those of us who remember rapid repair with horror as to all the problems that it may have created for some, the intent was to create an ability to house people and make their homes habitable after being so damaged by a storm. We have no such alternative for housing. There were talks about bringing cruise ships and doing other kinds of things. My fear is I'm going to have a tent city on the beach in summer months, and the Parks Department will not let that happen, I'm sure. But it will be a true conflict because we just don't know any answers to those kinds of concerns at this point. Legal services are complicated, and we work with a number of legal providers, and it's a lot of information gathering and waiting. And so there will be great demands. These are people who are at risk of fraud, of being handled fraudulently. And another concern when housing is out there as an issue is human trafficking. Remember, we're dealing with a large population of women and children who have never needed to be on their own and dealing with the decision-making exclusively for their families may hear of an apartment and wind up in a very difficult position. So I'll stop giving all this bad, yucky news. And if anybody has any questions, I have been asked about what's happening perhaps in other counties outside of New York City. I did ask my colleagues today that run Jewish community centers on Long Island. They each have seen a family or two that, one of their members are housing. But the Ukrainian churches, both the Orthodox churches as well as the Catholic churches that have Ukrainian leadership and congregations, are probably some of the best resources for anybody out in other boroughs, other counties, to know what is happening. But this is a national issue. New York just is going to be the mainstay of what we see. And I thank everybody for their interest and their concerns, and what Catholic Charities is doing and other providers will be incredibly beneficial for these people who are coming to us. We're worried about mental health as well. I'm already starting support groups for our Russian-speaking seniors who survived World War II because they are being re-traumatized by what they're seeing overseas. We're bringing in some staff training for PCTI work so that they are better able to more sensitively deal with assessment of cases and not build on the trauma. I can stop at any point, Zach.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I do want to point out James Linhart from Health and Hospitals provided his contact information in the chat.
Right.
In reference to the program Sue was talking about earlier. Any specific questions for Sue? And Sue, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
The question on everyone's mind, and I'm not sure that Sue or Mario or anybody can answer this, is, what are the numbers of people from Ukraine that we are seeing in the New York City area? I'm not sure anyone can answer that question yet.
That's the question that the city asks me, on a weekly basis. How many numbers are you seeing? I can only answer by giving the specifics of a school seeing 20 plus kids in a school. I can tell you that we had a program here on a Sunday, which was an information session around temporary protected status, when there was hopes it would get published in the Federal Register more quickly. We had probably 300 people registered to be talking to somebody at that event and show up that day, but we had probably 700 or 800 people flow through the building in a 4-hour period.
So I think I want to follow that by asking what feels like an obvious question, and that is the city really ready? Is the city really ready to do the work necessary to help the refugees who are here already and are coming our way? It doesn't quite sound as if that's the case.
So, I will tell you that promises have been made early on. I can sort of judge my timing on this because I was actually in Vail when I was in Vail just days after Russia invaded, and I've not yet been, although promises of additional resources, possibly for additional staff, and again, recognize it is my staff that are funded through other programs that have needed to pick up additional work to be able to do whatever is happening. So we have no additional staff, no additional cash assistance, no additional other kinds of capacity yet. I know that the city, this is a new administration. I think the timing has been terrible just in terms of city government, because they were at the very beginning of their own new administration. So new people are involved. I think they don't know which direction to dance in first.
So
I will tell you that, we have one program in Summer Rising, which is that city program that's supposed to be available for 110,000 children. And the DOE is running it. I have banged on those doors and I said, you're going to have Ukrainian kids who are going to be enrolled in these. You need to be thinking about the resources for them. I'm talking to our school here where we have 4 different local elementary schools plus District 75 kids, which I don't think many Ukrainian kids would have yet been enrolled in, but 4 elementary schools, they have to figure out what they're going to do. They need us to tell them stuff, but I don't even think they know who is in charge at this moment.
Thank you.
Bye,
Jen also had one last question, but want to leave time for other people as well. I want to mention that Iraq Chahansky from Carlina Rivera's office had joined us. He wanted to just listen in and to hear what's being said about what the needs are. And of course, Carlina Rivera represents the East Village, Alphabet City, Lower East Side, and an area known as Little Ukraine. So I just wanted folks to know that he's on with us. And to ask a final question is, what are our electeds doing? What are they gathering? This is to anybody who knows, and I know that there are some other representatives from elected officials on. What work are they doing to help prepare?
You know, our councilwoman is from Ukraine. They're very passionate, very trying to be involved, but it's not yet. They can only do so much. They only have so many resources. We're raising this attention. Our two councilmen down here in South Brooklyn, heavily impacted by, the Russian speaking world, are both Russian speaking and are trying to do what they can, but it is unclear what resources there are yet.
Iraq, did you want to add anything? And then I'll leave it open out to anybody else who wants to ask questions or make a comment.
Yeah, I could say something very briefly. Thank you, Ayo, and everyone for having me here. We're just listening in and trying to work with our colleagues and organizations that work with these specific communities and see how it can be of support. And everyone, if you have any ideas or any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to leave our email in the chat. And again, thank you so much for having me and providing this important information and conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Iraq.
Just to be honest, the time, I think we'll sort of wrap the conversation there. But it's an ongoing and conversation that will continue and take new shapes, particularly as this parole process begins. I will say separately, our friends at the Southern Brooklyn COAD are hosting a meeting this evening on cybersecurity with some really good guest presenters. I believe Laura McKenna, who provides leadership to that COAD, has put information in the chat on how you can register for that meeting. But I just wanted to share that little advertisement for our colleagues in Southern Brooklyn. Thanks so much for being on. I'll just say, if this is your first general meeting with us, our general meetings are always the second Wednesday of the month at 10 a.m. If you put your information in the chat, you're now added to our distribution list. So please look for announcement of the May meeting in the program for that. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much for joining. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.